Can I tell you a very provoking story? What Gen Z is asking for today is not unlike what I was asking for as a working mom. I want flexibility. But you can really work everywhere all the time now. And hybrid work kind of broke the old playbook. Gen Z doesn't realize that this is hybrid work. There was a moment in our research where we were talking about how hard hybrid is. One of our Gen Zers said, it's just how we work. This is really a change management issue for you older people. We also discovered is truly blind to their physical digital fluidity. Apologize to all the millennials in the room. We really stereotype them. Multiple generations are working side by side. One generation feels like they have to give something up so that another generation gets it. Some are much more comfortable communicating in a digital realm. Geography no longer limits collaboration. Technology is racing ahead. Culture is lagging behind. I think in the future, it's just going to be work. I think ironically, as we're freed from a set work location, it puts more weight on that physical work environment to do its job and to support the work that those workers need to do when they get there.
Work is broken. Gen Z can help us fix it, but will we let them? We've built rules of work for a world that's assumed a single breadwinner, an 8-to-5 assembly line, and clear lines between life and the office. But that's not the world that we live in now. The generation entering the workforce now has grown up fully digital first, to start their careers in a pandemic and to enter workplaces where hybrid is just normal. They're not asking for beanbags, kombucha, or foosball tables. They're asking for respect for people's lives and the planet, real transparency from leadership, and a voice in how work actually works. The question is, will leaders listen, or will we maintain yesterday's assumptions into an AI-powered future? Welcome to What the F is Happening to the Office. This is the show where we explore how work, the workplace, and the world around it are evolving. I'm Bob Fox, founder of Work Design, and in each episode, we talk with people shaping the future of work. Leaders, designers, researchers, and innovators who are redefining how and where we work. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share with others who are interested in how the work environments are changing. It helps us to bring you more conversations like this with the experts changing how and where work gets done. Today, I'm fortunate to be joined by Amanda Schneider, founder and president of ThinkLab, the research division of Sandow Design Group and sister brand to Interior Design magazine. Amanda and her team leads the interior design giants of design study, host the Design Nerds Anonymous podcast, and spend their days deep in data, focus groups, and conversations with leaders across the design and workplace ecosystem. She's coming out with a new book in June titled Work for What's Next: Why Workplace Culture is Failing and How the Next Generation Can Fix It. And in it, she argues that if we focus on business problems first and use generations as prototypes, not stereotypes, Gen Z can help us redesign work in ways that benefit everyone: younger talent, working parents, neurodiverse employees, and all the others our old rules never really fit. Amanda, welcome. I'm glad to have you
Thanks.
here.
I'm glad to be here.
Before we dive into the conversation, let me ask you a little bit about your own story. What was the moment where you thought work is broken, and if I can't find a workplace that works for me, I need to build one?
Yeah, I tell the full story in my TED Talks. I would encourage any of your listeners that haven't watched that to go ahead and seek that out. But the short of it is, I hit a point in my career where it felt like all my money was going to daycare and my kids were basically being raised by daycare. And I thought, what's the point? I've always wanted to be a great mom and I've always loved work. And so I took at that point what I thought was a sidestep in my career and started a company that was really around kind of different rules of work. It was a consultancy. That business that I started on my own actually ended up being so successful. I started it in 2011. By 2015, I had to incorporate and I started hiring other women like me, mamas that had left the traditional working world in search of something that wasn't a binary choice: keep working or be a stay-at-home mom. And together, we incorporated in 2015. We effectively doubled our revenue year over year, 100% by word of mouth, till ultimately we were acquired in 2018 by Sandow, who is the parent company to Interior Design magazine. So a lot of what I write about in the book are principles that we built that business on. And I feel like we prove success not only for the individuals, but also success for that business. And as we grew and scaled that business as part of Sandow, we started studying Gen Z. And again, as you'll hear in my talk, I think one of the things that shocked me most is what Gen Z is asking for today is not unlike what I was asking for as a working mom early in my career. So my hope is by studying them, what they're asking for, and really looking at them as prototypes, not stereotypes, as you said. When you prototype something, you keep what works and kind of iterate on what doesn't. We can really build a better future of work for all. So one thing I want to emphasize here, again, connecting it back to my story, is our approach to generations is not a traditional one where one generation feels like they have to give something up so that another generation gets it. I think we look not just at Gen Z and what they want, we look across all generations. All of our data looks across generations to help drive meaningful dialogue about what better means and help us really explore a better future.
I mean, it's a pretty exciting story. And I think that one we can all probably identify with. But, when you look at the system, what convinces you that there's a problem, and not just a rough patch that we're going through?
Yeah, I'll say if you read the comments on my TED Talk, the title's provocative on purpose, and it definitely provoked some people.
We'll put a link to the TED Talk in the description below.
That's great. Yeah. But I'll say what's different about this moment in time versus maybe generational challenges of the past. And I think what's different today is the speed of change. Our world of work is really changing faster than our ability to adapt. And I would also suggest that the gap is widening. And I'll walk through just 5 quick reasons that I think kind of explain this. The first one being that hybrid work kind of broke the old playbook, but we never agreed on a new one. The second one, I would say technology is racing ahead, but culture is lagging behind. Human change takes time. The third one, multiple generations are working side by side, but they come to that workplace with entirely different mental operating systems. Some are much more comfortable communicating in a digital realm, of which we were in much more than maybe when I started my career. And others are much less comfortable in these digital formats and really want to be in person more, but that time is lessening. Number 4, I'll say geography no longer limits collaboration. Yet trust is harder to build without shared context. Even if you're back in the office 5 days a week, chances are you're collaborating with other offices across the country, across the globe. And that's probably not going to change with globalization and how it's happening. And finally, number 5, work now lives everywhere all the time. You say you can work from anywhere, but you can really work everywhere all the time now. And I would say that fragments our attention, which is a much bigger issue we could definitely have a whole podcast on, and also really blurs boundaries. So I would say because of all those 5 reasons, what we're dealing with today is not just a culture clash, maybe of generations in the past. It's not just difference in preferences, which I think is often the path we go down when we talk about hybrid work. I think it really points to something deeper as a society. What we're looking at, I think, is a breakdown of trust in each other at work. And we could probably go into politics and culture and everything else where that breakdown of trust is happening. But for work, it's slowing performance. It can stall innovation. And I think it's quietly eroding the foundation of effective teams. And if we're not careful, this is going to become a real business problem. It's going to become a pipeline problem. So I think now is really the time to look at this. The pandemic gave us a real moment of pause, and we now have a choice. We can go back to the way things were. But I think in that moment of pause, we realized some of the way things weren't working for us either. So I think this is a really beautiful moment to not waste that pause that we had and make sure that we're building something better.
One of the things that you didn't mention is policies. I feel like there's been a huge misalignment of practices and what, people are actually doing versus the policies that organizations are trying to implement. Can you share some insight about that?
Yeah, I think we're at a really interesting moment in time, especially as we look at, again, going back to this trust issue, which is where I start in the book talking about a growing trust gap. Where trust is built very differently today. I think, not knowing what generation you are, I'm a Gen Xer. I think people in my generation and above, we grew up trusting authority. What's happening today is the youngest in our mix, they actually trust 5-star reviews on Amazon more than they trust the authority figures in place today. So I want to challenge when it comes to these policies, trust is really built in their minds from the bottom up today, from the feedback of their peers, from kind of this collective perception. And when we try to reverse that and really force it, I'll say force on purpose, force it from the top down, it actually erodes trust more than builds it.
You're very deliberate about saying when you start with business challenges, not generational challenges.
Mhm.
Does that conversation change when you start with issues like trust and burnout and retention?
I definitely think so because I think it's something that we got wrong about generational research with the millennials, right? And I always, when I'm speaking, I apologize to all the millennials in the room, right? Because we really stereotype them. And I'll say not everyone agrees that generational differences are even a problem. They're definitely not new. And, as a researcher, as someone who's built a business, scaled it, I know that people don't want to be convinced that they have a problem. If research doesn't solve a problem they're already feeling, that they already have, you're going to have a real hard time selling them on that research. So that's why we start with business issues. And I think if you Google it, talk to your peers, watch the news. If you haven't been living under a rock, especially over the last 5 years, you know that hybrid work has really posed a challenge and is posing some pretty polarizing views on what should and shouldn't be done. But I think one thing that I'll say both sides of the agreement agree on is that it's much harder to build culture today in this hybrid environment. So to me, by really focusing on the business challenges first and using this generational lens to help solve it, we really start to dial in on a problem that both sides of the equation agree that we have. And we can really gain more open-mindedness to exploring new solutions to solving them.
Hybrid's one of those things that I don't know that there's a really good definition of it, except that most people accept it as 3 days a week in the office. But I think the way that a Zoomer would look at that would be to say, well, that's just the way that I'm used to working. They've grown up in that digital world.
Yeah. Can I tell you a very provoking story that happened in our research? And I tell this in the TED Talk as well, but there was a moment in our research where we were talking about how hard hybrid is. And one of our Gen Zers said, permission to speak freely. I said, of course. And they said, y'all keep talking about how hybrid is hard. It's not hard. It's just how we work. This is really a change management issue for you older people. And I warned you, provoking, especially as a Gen Xer, definitely that was provoking to me. But there is a little bit of truth in that. We call it hybrid work today. I think in the future, it's just going to be work. It's just going to be how we work. I think this is a moment of change for those of us that knew, as one Gen Z podcast interviewee called it, for those that knew the before, it's definitely a change. But the earliest of Gen Z graduated actually 2019, assuming they had a traditional 4-year college degree. So at best, they had less than a year in the before the pandemic hit. So what is a big change to all of us, decades of experience, speaking for myself, in a traditional office environment, in the traditional work world that we knew before, this is really a huge change. But for these Gen Zers, who in our research we also discovered is truly blind to their physical digital fluidity. You ask them what they do online and they talk about connecting with people. You ask them what they do when they're together, or just watch my sons who are Gen Z and Gen Alpha. They're all playing a game in the same room, but from their individual devices, right? So this digital fluidity is just to them as natural as the air they breathe. So I love the line, a fish doesn't know it's in water, it's just swimming. And in the same way, it's one reason I focus so much on Gen Z in the book, because Gen Z doesn't realize that this is hybrid work. It's just the way they work. So by watching them, observing them, again, prototyping, take what works, leave what doesn't, I think that we can really help discover a better way of working for all of us that can work better than this, I'll call it purgatory that we're in right now.
Yeah, and you've said basically Gen Z is asking what all of us have really wanted all along, that flexibility, that transparency, impact. Does the Gen Z ask actually reveal a better model for us?
I think it's super interesting, and I think I'll go back to my comment about generational research for the millennials. I was at a conference and I was sitting next to a boomer friend of mine who happened to be head of sales for a large product manufacturer. And the speaker on stage was saying, Gen Z wants flexibility. And he would lean over and say, I want flexibility. And then they would say, millennials want more money. And he would lean over and say, I want more money. And I think that that's the problem with generational research is, again, often gets our heckles up and says, I have to give something up so that you get what you want. But when we really look at, especially what this generation, I will say, is not just asking for, what they are demanding, it's what a lot of us want too. And I'll just share another quick story about a moment in the book writing process where I was writing a chapter on loyalty. And it goes a lot into kind of career progression and what Gen Z is looking for, maybe a little bit different than years past. Only 6% of Gen Z actually wants to go into a traditional leadership role, which is really shocking as we look into, our leadership pipelines of the future. And, she reacted very viscerally to something that I had written in that chapter and said, oh my God, Gen Z, they seem so entitled. They don't want to do their time. They just want to, get into these big titles. They want more money. They don't want to wait. They don't want to do the time like we had to. And we had a pretty heated exchange back and forth. She is a Gen Xer like me. And by the end of it, she said something along this lines. I'm paraphrasing because I'm not reading it, but it was basically like, as frustrated as I am with what they're asking for, when I really get past my anger, what they're asking for is what I want too. They want work-life balance. They want a sustainable career, but also sustainable for their own mental health. And um, when I recognize that that's what I want too, it's much easier to think about how we can all collectively get it than me giving something up to give them what they want.
I think you and I probably grew up in a world where we're very focused on our careers. And that was, really the priority for us, I think, throughout most of our lives, adult lives. I think the Gen Zers, it's almost the opposite. It's like their, personal lives are what really matters, and the jobs tend to support, what their goals and desires are in their personal lives. So, I mean, how do you see that playing out in the work world?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a choice. We can ignore it. We can try to force them into our way of thinking, which is going to be uncomfortable. Newsflash, it's not going to work. Or we can kind of look at how we can shift our own mindset to understand that and harness it. And one example I'll give that I share in the book is, Gen Z is very entrepreneurial in mindset. They have lots of different interests. I think if you look at the way you or I thought about our career, it was really probably very linear. How do I step up that ladder? How do I get more experience to, go to this new level? Gen Z tends to have a lot of varied interests. For the podcast, I interviewed a young gentleman who is a Gen Z author. So he's already written a book. He's started a company and he has a software programming day job. And one of the things he said very plainly in that podcast interview is, we have a lot of interests and it could benefit you if you harness that for the good of your company. So the idea that we pose in the book, one of them is really looking at entrepreneurship models. You could let your employees start a company outside of work. They could have some kind of hobby that they're turning into a business on Etsy that they're doing. But what if instead of encouraging them to do that outside of the company, what if there were more not entrepreneurship models, but intrapreneurship models where you kind of brought that into the firm and really, architecture firm, if we're talking about that, or whatever other kind of business, and encourage people to take that entrepreneurial energy, but harness it in a way that rewards risk taking, not punish mistakes, and encourages them to kind of channel that energy into the good of their personal interests, but in a way that also benefits the business. So, all that to say, I think we could be frustrated by it. We could ignore it. We could try and force them into our way of thinking, or we could really look at, okay, how could we harness this to benefit both the business and that individual?
And what you're beginning to touch on, I think, are the leadership qualities that are going to attract Gen Z and really inspire Gen Z in order to get work done. What are the behaviors that they look for in leaders that they're working for?
So this is a really fascinating conversation to me because I think, again, to kind of flip the script, and one of my biggest joys in the work that I do is helping people have what Adam Grant calls vuja day moments. So it's the opposite of a deja vu, which is seeing something that you've seen 1,000 times, but with fresh eyes, right? One of my favorite discoveries in researching, all of this topic for the book, for the talk, for all of this was really looking at what good leadership looks like by generation. Now, most of us of a certain generation and older were raised with the golden rule: treat others the way you want to be treated. But if we look at some great research by Mark McCrindle and his team, he is a researcher, a generational researcher out of Australia. I would call him the world's foremost expert on generations and what their differences are. We just had him on my Design Nerds Anonymous podcast, but his team has put out some really interesting information about what each generation looks for in a leader. To baby boomers, good leaders direct. To Gen X, good leaders coordinate. Here's where we start to see it shift. So for millennials, good leaders guide, but to Gen Z, good leaders empower. And we heard this over and over and over in our research. I trust you when you trust me. I believe in you when you believe in me. Like whatever you want to fill in those blanks. This empowerment word was really, really strong in a lot of our research. And if you push that even further, what McCrindle's team is saying is that Gen Alpha to them, and Gen Alpha is the generation that comes after Gen Z, to Gen Alpha, good leaders inspire. So what I want to challenge is this shift that we all have to think of. If you look at even this RTO, the return to office movement, that is our baby boomer CEOs often treating others, this golden rule, treating others the way they want to be treated. Good leaders direct. They're modeling the behavior that they want to see in a time of crisis is how do we model really, really good? But you can imagine if somebody is really kind of pushing leadership around command, control, coordinate over guide, empower, inspire, it's actually having the opposite effect. So what we challenge is, maybe instead of the golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated, is the platinum rule. Treat others the way they want to be treated. And I know that's scary and it feels like, oh my God, if I have 400 employees, how am I supposed to treat people 400 different ways? It's going to require a lot more compromise, which is one reason why hybrid work is the hardest. But I'll say that companies that really start to restructure around these beliefs of what good leadership look like will be far better positioned to attract and grow that next generation of managers and leaders.
So I'm just thinking that if you could rewrite just one or two of those foundational rules tomorrow we've all lived in, what would you change first?
Yeah. I mean, I rewrite 10 of them in the book. So I got a little ambitious there. But I would say, the first step in rewriting these rules is really name it to tame it. I think that is kind of where we have to start. I think that's a foundational concept that comes from psychology is before we can fix the emotion or the reaction to that emotion that we're having, we have to be able to name it so that we can do something about it or put in business terms, you can't fix what you can't measure. But I will say if I had to pick just one of them, there's data from the Future Forum that says that people actually want more flexibility in when they work than where they work. And that was a big aha for me when I first learned that, because it's super interesting as we look at all of the media coverage that's happening around this RTO movement. It's all about the where. Not a lot of the conversation is really looking at when. So if I had to direct a leader about, which one, or direct society and the system about which one to tackle first, I would say tackle when we work before we really worry as much about where we work. I think, growing up when my dad said to me, I'm going to work, or my mom said to me, I'm going to work, that was a noun. It was a physical place. I knew they were physically going to work. But listen, I built this whole business on a fully remote digital first model that is now 15 years in the making. My sons are 12, 15, and 17. And to them, work is a verb. When I say I'm going to work, that might mean I'm going to my office at the whole house. It might mean I'm going to a Starbucks. It might mean I'm going to a client's office. It might mean I'm flying to New York to go to Sandow's offices. So I think that the biggest shift and the biggest opportunity, if I had to, give advice to the system and how I'd fix it, would be to shift this mindset from work as a noun to work as a verb. And I want to caveat that just a little bit by also saying this does not mean that the workplace is not important. I think that's very important to your audience and your passions, Bob, as well as my audience and my passions. I think, ironically, as we're freed from a set work location, it puts more weight on that physical work environment to do its job and to support the work that those workers need to do when they get there.
I think that we are in this incredibly fascinating period of time. We've come out of the pandemic. We kicked everybody out of their office. We had an incredible opportunity to change things. Things didn't really change that much. But what I hear you saying now is that, we are in a very different world. So how does the physical environment play into that? Where is its role in helping to support an organization?
Yeah, I think everyone wants the magical Ozempic of what the physical environment needs to do. Just I don't want to do diet and exercise. Like, don't give me a diet and exercise plan. Just give me a shot because I want to be skinny. And so I can tell you, Bob, if I knew exactly here's your checklist, here's your Ozempic for your physical office and what it needs to do, I would be very rich and on a yacht somewhere because I think we're all still figuring that out. We had a fantastic podcast interview that we titled the episode, The Future of Work is the Entanglement of HR, IT, and Workplace Design. And I think that, as we look at all these three letters that we're looking for, RTO, ROI, return on investment for that RTO, or I've heard some new ones that I really like, return on interaction, that's really looking at, how we get people to interact when they're in the office, or return on commute, ROC. I think we're all looking for all of those things. But unfortunately, I don't think in 2026, even we're going to get to the magical checklist of Ozempic facts that you just need to do these 10 things and you'll be skinny. Do these 10 things and you'll have an office that helps your hybrid team thrive. I think it's going to be a lot of experimentation. And I think it starts with people, it goes to your processes, and then it goes to place. It doesn't mean that place can't be part of those people in process and reinforcing of those people in process. All of those things really have to work in this, entangled future. But if we don't know what better looks like to each of us individually, we can't develop systems that are better for all of us. And so I think it really has to start with that individual. We have to really keep experimenting and working on these systems. And I think the space can be very responsive, very supportive, really help drive some of those behaviors, but not before we decide what better looks like.
This is fascinating for me because I think what you touch on is historically the system was a real estate deal. And now I think what people are looking for is to say, how can I use this as a tool to empower, enable, support my
Hmm.
organization? And so I think we're seeing a shift towards much more interaction that's occurring within the work environment. And that's where the real value lies.
And as a data nerd, I will also direct you and your listeners to actually someone who would make a phenomenal podcast interview, someone I've had on my podcast, Design Nerds Anonymous, a gentleman named Rob Sadow. So he runs an organization called Flex Index that is really looking at, we've often relied on measures like people per square foot or occupancy, or, just because someone's physically in an office doesn't mean they were able to get their work done or even that it was a great experience. So what he is doing is really encouraging companies to report in on a variety of metrics that help us figure out what those next measures of success are going to be. And he's got some great data on what the best companies that are really nailing this hybrid world, what they're doing a little bit differently and how they're measuring success.
You've been pretty candid about your experience as a working mom. How has that personal experience shaped the way that you think about redesigning work, not just for Gen Z, but for caregivers, for parents, and all the other stakeholders that are involved?
Yeah, that's a big question. I will say it's been a journey for me and one that I think I'm still on. To be perfectly vulnerable and transparent. I was raised by girl power parents. They taught me that girls could do anything that little boys could do, which, you may think in this day and age doesn't need to be taught, but I could really spin your head with the stupid things that people have said to me when traveling. And I'll use a simple example that, when I travel, people are always like, oh, who takes care of your kids? I do about 30 keynotes a year. And inevitably, someone very, very well meaning says, who takes care of your kids when you travel? My husband also travels. He's also got a big, very important job. Guess how often he's asked that? Yeah,
Never.
never. So I think I was raised to think that girls could do anything. And I definitely, flight fight, flight, or freeze. I'm definitely a fighter in those situations. So I love the idea of really challenging some of these systems. But then I was blessed with sons. And it's really interesting because that helped me see for the first time the different, but I will say equally crushing pressures that society puts on men in our society, especially around work. And there's a whole section in the book that really talks about, the pressure on women and extra caregiving duties that they face that really doesn't put them on an equal playing field in the workplace. But I'll also challenge that I don't think our traditional rules around work are working for men and their mental health either. I think to add to that, we're also in a really politically weighted moment with the DEI backlash. And I think that it's one reason that I really love the timing of this book coming out. Again, looking at the pandemic really gave us a moment to pause and really look at what wasn't working. If you look at the RTO movement, how it is hitting women worse than men, more women are leaving the workforce in 2025 and 2026 than men, how it's hitting people of color. I think that this is a really a beautiful moment to make sure that we are pausing to reflect on what we learned during the pandemic to make sure that we don't lose it. And I want to share one other just stat that's in the book that was really fascinating to me. We all know employee engagement is down, and it will shock no one to know that in 2020, we saw one of the sharpest declines in workplace engagement in our nation's history. However, I think what's really interesting and what's happening right now is we actually saw a similar decline, the first and only one of its kind, actually over the past year. So it was like right in that 24 to 2025 range, we saw a very similar decline. And I want to challenge a lot of that is burnout. If you listen to our most recent season 9 of Design Nerds Anonymous, we get really deep in this group therapy, research, live experiential research event with a lot of our end users that are making decisions for the built environment. And one of the biggest common themes you're going to hear in those podcast episodes is burnout. It actually surprised us. It was their second largest challenge to getting projects done today is that everyone's moving faster than ever with leaner teams than ever, with more decision makers involved than ever for a variety of reasons. And so I think this drop in engagement is really a direct result of burnout because we are trying to reopen and go back to the rules as we knew them, but we've already recognized they don't work. And we're in this purgatory of a world that is forcing burnout to men, to women, that is, forcing people back out of this world that were really included during the pandemic. And I think that this is why now is the time to really look at all of these rules and systems around work and see if we can't get to somewhere better because it's not working for anybody today.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that because I think one thing coming out of the pandemic that was positive for the work environment is that it became much more human centric. There was a lot more science around humans, what affected their conditions, the biophilia, health and well-being, sustainability, all of those issues became front and center in the way that we think about work environments today. So and there's no question, I think work is becoming much more complex. I mean, if we look at all the issues that we have to deal with just to put a building and space together, there's exponentially more that we have to deal with than what we did 10 years ago. So I'm curious to see how those things are all going to play out, how they come crashing together, something that one person can't handle. I'm just wondering how you look at that from a generational perspective. How can younger people adapt in that kind of an environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real danger right now. It's no secret that the youngest among us is the one that's struggling highest with these levels of burnout, with levels of depression, with levels of overwhelm. And this isn't a direct answer because I can't say that I know exactly how to fix it or that I have the Ozempic solution for that fix either. But I think one of our biggest challenges today is this fragmentation of attention. Everyone has read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. There's another one that's a slightly more positive spin on that is called Stolen Focus, that suggests maybe it's not social media that is destroying our kids, but it is this idea that we can't think deeply anymore because there's so much flying at us. And he actually opens that book with a story of a dystopian future where they're trying to make everyone equal, right? So the strong people, the strongest of their human race have to have one arm tied behind their back because they have to make them not too strong. They have to be level playing field. And the smartest, what they do is they have headphones on and they play a deafening noise every 20 minutes so that the smartest ones can't think too deeply and they, get really, really distracted. And he ties that to kind of what we're doing to ourselves. Look at the stats about how often people check their phone in a given day. Look at how our kids study today. They've got TV on, they've got earbuds in their ear, and they're playing a game, and somebody's on the phone, and they're trying to do their homework. So I think, part of the challenge today is this stolen focus, I will say, combined with what I believe to be risk aversion. So in these live experiential research events that we do across corporate, healthcare, education, hospitality, one of the questions that we ask, we play a game of Would You Rather. It's my favorite way to kick off presentations. And one of the questions that we ask is, would you rather be solely responsible for the outcome of all decisions made about space over the next year, or double the size of your decision-making committee? And we make them stand up and sit down. So everybody has to vote. You can't just put up your hands twice or not at all. And interestingly, around 90% of people would rather double the size of their decision-making committee. Only around 10% would rather take sole accountability and sole responsibility for that. And in some cities, it was 100%. We did an event in Chicago and 100% of the room remained standing. They said, I'd rather double the size of my committee, which also is interesting because the decision-making committee has already doubled. Zoom makes it easier to join in. Costs are on the rise, so more people are kind of having to weigh in. And so as you look at that, I think it really signals this risk aversion. And, if I'm playing psychologist of the United States here, I think I would say it's that lack of ability to focus along with this risk aversion. And so I think if we really want to empower our youth and we really want to put them in the driver's seat, it's figuring out how their brains are wired so we can activate them. I think that it is also helping balance this synchronous and asynchronous work in new ways. And that's a big part of the book. We talk a lot about the phygital world that we're living in. That's physical plus digital. And I think most of us are built as analog natives. This is borrowing from a brilliant woman by the name of Hannah Grady Williams, that those of us over 35 tend to think analog first, digital second. And just look at even in our industry, how we do pricers and put pricers online, right? They even have the whoosh, whoosh sound to help transition our generation change management into the digital world, right? But our digital first natives are these digital natives that grew up in the digital world first, analog second, think of things wholly differently. And so I think there's a real opportunity, not only in balancing the synchronous and asynchronous, but again, looking at these fish swimming in water, just the air they breathe. And how do we harness this digital first mindset for the digital first world that we're all living in, whether we are born into it or not?
It's fascinating. There's so many things in there that I want to dive into. But you've said that we can't design for what's next until we solve some of the human problems first. And so building on that, I think, what are the core human needs and behaviors that workplace designers really need to be solving for as we think about this next iteration of space? If there is an iteration of space, or we may all be in some digital world somewhere.
No, I mean, as much as I am pro digital first, I deeply hold the belief that there is nothing like being face to face and in person when you can, especially for speed of relationship building. So I think that we need to think about balancing these worlds, so digital can spark, but human makes it stick. Right. And so how do we balance these two worlds? And I think that that is the biggest challenge that we're trying to kind of understand. And so, I'll give you kind of a 3-step process that we talk about in the book. And step 1 is read chapter 3 of the book, because what we call it is enter your era of intentional selfhood. And we use that terminology very, very specifically because when I was preparing for my TED Talk, I was practicing, God bless my best friend, because she heard this darn thing. She probably has it memorized still right now. But my best friend, Beth, there was a line in the talk that says the future of work starts with each of us understanding when and where we work best. And she said to me once, Amanda, all due respect, like, you think about these things for a living, but I have never thought about when and where I work best. Like, it's just some place that I went. I got a job, I got a key card, and I went to the office from 8 to 5 because that's just what you did. Like, I've honestly never thought about it. So we designed a chapter in the book that really is a lot of the questions as I was building this business, as I was helping usher these brilliant women out of a traditional 9 to 5 job into this working world that was our digital first world that we built this company around. These are questions that I asked each of them to help them kind of with self-discovery. Are they ready for this? Do they want this? What do they want? And so I would encourage everyone to start by reading that chapter 3 that really is focused on the individual and helping define when and where you work best. Because guess what? If I work best at 4 a.m., you don't want to be forced to work at 4 a.m. Most people do not work best at 4 a.m., right? But if I can get 2 hours of work done in 1 hour at 4 a.m., I guarantee my boss is like, go ahead, do your focus work at 4 a.m. Like, who cares when you do that? Step 1 is really figuring out when and where you work best. Then step 2 is really doing the teamwork, because if I work best at 4 a.m., you work best at 10 p.m., how the hell are we going to make that work? Because we can't have 400 employees and 400 different ways of working. So there's another book called How the Future Works. Brian Elliott, Sheila Subramanian, Helen Krupp. Fantastic book with so many tangible tools that you can work on with your team. One of them is called a team level agreement. So that's once we're all clear individually what we need to do, how we work best, what's going to work for us, is coming together and saying, okay, how do we overlap? Maybe it's agreed upon, synchronous meeting times are between 10 and 3 every day. You have to be available. Or for, Zoom meetings, you have to be in the office, whatever it is. What are those agreed upon times for synchronous meetings, for in-person meetings, for when do you have to be available? Are you available 24/7, or after a certain time period, are you not available? Step 2, that team level agreement will really help you do that. And then step 3, I think, is where, again, we're building this trust from the bottom up, because it helps to really look at systematizing those. So this is where all of our micro cultures start to come together, and we start to build up from the bottom up to say, how do all of these kind of create a scaffolding for the company that everyone can get behind, that really starts to define who our culture is as built by the people that make it up? So I think that that's where, cementing and reinforcing these processes is where HR comes in. It's where your leadership team comes in to really reinforce this, to call out the teams that help kind of make these work, to really share what's working and what's not. So hopefully that's kind of clear. Those 3 levels: start with the individual, work on the team level agreements, and then start to cement the processes.
For a leader listening who wants to start building from the bottom up, what are some of the simple first steps to engage their team in creating these new norms?
Yeah, I mean, I really think, I guess first I'll say, please read my book, because I think there's a lot of great bite-sized steps that you can take and things that you can do in there. But I think the other piece of this is, I would say to that leader, really look at your mid-level managers. Make sure that we're empowering them and empowering them with these soft skills. So I think it's easy to say, when I talk about soft skills, it's easy to say Gen Z lacks soft skills, things like how to talk to people, things like what etiquette look like, all of that. But I also want to suggest that all of the context around soft skills, what etiquette should be, what it looks like today as we enter this increasingly digital era, is totally different. Like, I don't know about you, Bob, but like when I found out that the skull and crossbones emoji really means funny, like that was a big aha moment for me, right? Like, we communicate differently digitally than we do when we're only in person and only face to face. And as we talked about when we looked across generations of what good leadership even looks like to these different generations, again, that's what I mean when I say they're all coming to the workplace with these different mental operating systems. So I think what's happening today, especially in this moment we're in, where all these top-down RTO policies are colliding with what the people down here, really want, the people caught in the middle are these mid-level managers. And many of them were promoted because they were really good at their job. But what makes you really good at being an engineer or an accountant or an architect or a researcher doesn't always make you great at being a manager. And as this world accelerates with AI, the things that make us human are what is really going to be our competitive advantage. So I think one of the biggest things that we can do is empower these mid-level managers that are translators, bottom to top, top to bottom, and make sure that they are excelling in the human side of the work that we do every day, that can help really not only do their job, but actually help others do their job and pave the way for this communication up and down.
You've said that, if we don't rethink work now, we risk locking old biases and assumptions into AI systems and job definitions. So Where do you see the biggest risk and the biggest opportunity for AI coming into the workplace to actually support the work that we're doing instead of just scaling bad habits?
Yeah, I want to go back to my we got to name it to tame it phrase. I think that's a really important one because I think, especially as we are moving quicker than we're ready for into this AI era, if we aren't aware of our biases, we risk programming them into literally programming them into the software that will run kind of this next phase of humanity that we're kind of coming in. I don't think it's always malicious, and I'll use a couple of stolen examples. One is there's a phenomenal speaker. If you're looking for a speaker for an event, her name is Moji Akinde. And she really speaks on AI as well as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the examples she kicked off the first time I heard her speak was about washing your hands. She's African, has very dark skin, and she was having a very bad day and went into the bathroom to wash her hands, and the faucets wouldn't turn on. The faucets weren't malfunctioning, the faucets were programmed to sense light skin, and her skin was too dark to even activate the faucet. So I think that's one example. You can hear other examples of that. I know my husband is in, the programming world, and he working on a lot of visual identification software that could kind of scan crowds and look for bad guys in the crowd. And some of those systems originally could only recognize light skin and not necessarily dark skin because they were programmed by white men mostly. So I say all of this because I think that this is a moment that we are in where we have to make sure, nobody wants to think that they're biased. We all want to think that we're good people. But I think we really have to recognize the inherent bias that may be in our systems so that we don't unintentionally program it into these next systems. I want to think few of us are intentionally bad, which is why we want to think, oh, I'm not biased. I'm not prejudiced. I don't have any of these, unintentional thoughts when I see X, Y, or Z, but we can't fix what we can't acknowledge. So I think this is really, I guess I'm treading a little light in here. We don't want to go one way. We don't want to be canceled because that makes everyone, this cancel culture movement made everyone afraid to speak up and try. I don't think that that's the right way, but we also, don't want to go the opposite direction where it's just, you know, I'm not biased. I think that that's a little bit of an ostrich and putting our head in the hole. So I think by calling out some of these things and really naming them, we can measure them, we can fix them.
Diving a little bit deeper into that, to me, the diversity is multidimensional. And I think that it's people coming into the work environment with different ideas, different experiences, living in different places that are what enable us to innovate. Somebody looking at a problem with a different perspective or a different background than what I bring to the table to me is going to force me to stop and think, hey, that's a new idea. That's going to spark something and that's going to create something new that we haven't thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really one of the primary functions of the work environment today is really to bring all those different ideas together and somehow share those ideas. But it's those casual interactions and that social interaction to me that we have to support and reinforce in order for our organizations to grow and thrive.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Agreed. And I think, to the water cooler, to us, the water cooler was a place that you actually got water. But today in our digital first company, we have a water cooler channel on Slack. And it's where we post like, oh my God, look at my cat sleeping next to me. It's so cute. And it's a way that we build that trust and connection with our fully remote team. So even recognizing that something as simple as these old successes could be transitioned into this new era in a way that helps build that trust.
So your book is called Work for What's Next. And when you look ahead 5 to 10 years, what gives you the most hope that we can build better workplaces, work better for our kids and for the people that are just entering the workforce now?
This is going to probably sound dramatic, but I will say one way or another, this reckoning will come. We're already at a labor shortage, with in the US and with fewer available workers, and that number is kind of growing. So I think what's going to happen is either, we want to have this binary argument, but I don't think that it's going to be that binary. One of the lines in my TED Talk says, in the future, some people are going to be fully back in office and that will be their competitive advantage. Some people will be fully remote and that will be their competitive advantage. but most people are going to exist somewhere in between. And I think that that is, something that I really want to encourage us to think about is not just, is it this or is it that? Are they right or is this right? But how do we really discover these options in between? Because I think that in between, this hybrid world is the hardest. And that's what we've got to figure out. But for some people, they want to be back in the office 5 days a week. So be bold about your policies. Help those people find better career matches. For other people, they want the flexibility, the autonomy. They work really, really well remotely. That's me. Come talk to me about how I built my business. For the majority, it's probably going to be in between. And I had a lovely gentleman named Matthew Marzinski on my podcast recently. He runs this hybrid equity program and looking at technology for Microsoft to help make meetings that are hybrid more effective. And one of the things he talked about is the patterns that they're seeing are not Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in the office, Thursday, Friday out, or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office, Monday, Friday out. It's much more, I'm going to come in to do the work that I need to do, but I want to pick up my kid by 3 o'clock so I can go to the soccer game. And then I'm going to do my heads down work at home. So I think we're really starting to see some of these patterns changing. And I think by companies really focusing this as an intentional conversation, by individuals focusing this as an intentional conversation, we can help it happen the way it wants to and the way that we want it to, not by chance. And my hope in the future is there's not one right or wrong way, that part of the interview process is really, do you expect people to be in person 5 days a week? If so, that's a great fit for me. Or do you expect people to be remote 5 days a week? Maybe that's not a great fit for me. How do we get really clear on who our company is and who we are as an individual so that we can really have these different options and make better matches?
Yeah, no, that's great. We've talked about a lot of different things and my head's kind of spinning, but we're coming up on time. And I'm just wondering, is there anything that we've left out that you think is important to include in this conversation?
Goodness, there's so much more to talk about here. I will say, in the book, we explore these business challenges from what we're trying to solve. Things like trust and connection, recruiting, retaining, how that's kind of looking different, and things like culture and purpose, how that's starting to shift as we look at this data across generations, mentorship and learning, communication, collaboration. Like these are the 10 challenges that we solve across these. And my hope is that we start to look at all of these business challenges and these potential solutions as opportunities and experiments, and that a lot of your listeners will kind of join me in this iterative process that helps get to an intentional, better future.
So I'll ask you one last question. If a CEO or HR leader or head of workplace is listening to this on their commute into the office, what's one question that you would love for them to take back to their team?
Yeah, I think I'm going to loop us back around to where we started, which is work is broken. Gen Z can help us fix it if we let them. So I want to ask you to think about, or maybe ask your teams, what is one rule that you see about work that's broken, and how would you fix it?
Amanda, why don't we wrap up and tell us about your book and where people can find it?
Absolutely. So it will be available on Amazon. The title is Work for What's Next. You'll be able to find that link as soon as February of 2026. The official books will ship. We'll start shipping in May of 2026. So definitely look for that book, Work for What's Next by Amanda Schneider. I would also encourage you in the meantime to follow my podcast, Design Nerds Anonymous, wherever you listen to podcasts. We explore this intersection between business and design and how kind of that right brain meets left brain. And I'm a big LinkedIner. So if you want to find me, Amanda Schneider on LinkedIn, that would be the third place you could find me.
Amanda, well, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate taking the time.
Thanks for the opportunity.